Resident Evil is a beloved gaming franchise that is more popular right now than it's ever been. But every attempt to turn the series into a successful live-action adaptation has failed thus far, not failing in profit, but in quality. We're going to find out why that is by taking a look at the previous versions and finding out exactly why they failed. Not only that, we'll also be exploring the potential of what I think a good Resident Evil adaptation could look like. Video game adaptations are Hollywood's newest obsession. They're bigger than they've ever been. The Last of Us is massively successful and critically acclaimed. Fallout had an incredibly successful adaptational outing this year, and the Super Mario Bros. Movie made $1 billion. They're even getting to the point of outselling a lot of these major big-budget blockbuster superhero movies. On one hand, it's nice to have something other than a superhero movie, but on the other hand, this might just be a new bandwagon for studios to hop on. There are already so many video game adaptations that have come out in the last few years, and that's not even mentioning the immensity of video game adaptations that are currently in active development right now. Because there is a lot. Borderlands, Sonic the Hedgehog Minecraft 3, the movie, Super Mario Bros. Movie 2, Until Dawn, Gears of Mortal Kombat Return 2, to Silent Hill, Death Stranding, Street Fighter, Days Gone, Pokemon Detective Space Channel 5, Comic Stray, Mega Man, The Last of Us Season 2, Gravity Rush, It Takes Slime Rancher, Ark Survival Evolved, Streets of Rage, ToeJam and Earl, Saints Row, Beyond Good and Evil, Firewatch, The Division, Sifu. Wow, that's a lot. From the time of writing this video to its release, I wasn't finished yet. Tomb Raider, The Legend of Laura, Fallout Season 2, by Daylight, Rise of Zero Dawn, Season 2, Castlevania, Call of Duty 2, Grounded, Alan Wake, Brother in Arms, Friend Pedro, System Shock. And that new Legend of Zelda movie is also in development and is live action for some reason. From the time of writing this video to its release, I'm sure some other video game adaptations will get announced. That's how frequent they've become. These video game adaptations are getting greenlit and flying into theaters and onto streaming services like hotcakes. People can't seem to get enough of them. Back in the early 2000s and 1990s, you'd get your occasional Max Payne, or Super Mario Bros., or maybe even a Mortal Kombat, and they were never good. If a video game movie was getting made back then, it was almost a guarantee that it was going to be an absolute trash heap. Remember the video game curse? Back then, there had never been a good adaptation of a video game, so most people just thought it couldn't be done. But times have changed, with incredible successes coming out left and right. Castlevania, Arcane, Cyberpunk Edgerunners. Now, whenever a video game adaptation gets announced, depending on who's working on it, there's a 20% chance that it could be alright, and a 5% chance that it could be great. And before you ask, no, I will not be showing where I got that statistic from, because I fucking made it up. One video game franchise that has existed in both of these time periods. The total trash bin adaptations and the current renaissance era of video game adaptations is Resident Evil.
Resident Evil.
I'm a big fan of Resident Evil, and I'm a newer fan. The Resident Evil 2 remake is what really got me into the series, as it did with a lot of other people. The tone and atmosphere of the near-abandoned police station, the feeling of dread when it comes to getting around a hallway filled with zombies or, God forbid, a licker or two, and that constant feeling that someone is following you and getting ever closer.
It was perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
Looking at this franchise, it's ripe for a proper adaptation, were that to be a series or a film. It's got the horror, it's got that classic Resident Evil campiness, and it's got the iconic characters of the franchise. Jill Valentine.
Bitch can't even swim.
Chris Redfield. Leon Kennedy.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
And of course, the one, the only, Ethan Winters. No. I'm just joking. That guy is as bland as white bread.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine.
If Resident Evil is so deserving of an adaptation, then why hasn't it had a good one yet? I will tell you that there has not been a single good Resident Evil adaptation. And I'm not talking about one that's fine or, it's okay. I mean one that is truly phenomenal. One that is something Resident Evil fans can point to and be proud of. Something on the level of the Fallout series, where it causes a massive spike in video game sales because the fans of the show are so interested in stepping into the world that they've been experiencing on screen. Nobody is watching Resident Evil Afterlife 3D like, oh yeah, I gotta try this shit out. The only people that watch Resident Evil movies are fans, and those fans always leave feeling disappointed. or at best in a state of copium. Last year I made a 2-part video going over one of the most recent attempts at an adaptation, and how it failed miserably. Any comments I got that were actually defending the movie were, at best, lukewarm.
It was fun, and at least they tried and actually had the real character.
Honestly, this movie wasn't great, but I fully appreciated that they at least tried to keep it close to the games. I had fun with it, but I'm a zombie film buff, and sometimes the worse they are, the more fun they are to watch, so while I saw all the horrible tropes, bad lines, poor casting, I still enjoyed it for what it was, a cheesy zombie flick.
It is terrible. Total disservice to the characters and their characterizations, but it's still better than Anderson's set of films, or at least everything after the end of 2, and whatever Abomination that Netflix series was.
I'd rather watch this than any of that Paul W.S. crap, and especially that Netflix shit.
I forced myself to like it.
The first official Resident Evil adaptation we ever had was from none other than Paul W.S. Anderson. Mr. Anderson had already dipped his toe into the realm of video game adaptations with the much maligned Mortal Kombat movie of 1995. This was destined to be a disaster. It turned out exactly how you'd imagine. It's a very, very, very loose adaptation of Resident Evil 1. It's set in a mansion, and there's an underground lab of science experiments. That's about as deep as the similarities go. The only notable moment from this movie is the laser hallway, which is actually really cool. These movies were successful enough to merit 5 sequels.
What the hell?
It's almost as if these movies decide on a whim if they want to follow the story of the games as they go on. The first film loosely follows the first game, but all of the characters are different. Resident Evil Apocalypse tries to follow the story of Resident Evil 3, somewhat, but kicks Jill to the side so that Alice still gets to be the main character.
I'm good, but I'm not that good.
Extinction is Mad Max for some reason. Afterlife 3D takes elements of RE5 and kind of tacks them onto the third act with no real build-up. Retribution is practically fan fiction, and the final chapter claws its way across the finish line with nothing more than a poorly edited whimper. While these films at times have similarities to the source material, they more often than not just ignore it. A lot of people that enjoy these movies seemingly do it ironically, and to those of you that don't, you have to admit that it's at the very least a poor representation of what the Resident Evil games are. Alice is the main character of this action zombie film that happens to share the same name as the Resident Evil games. Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City, a movie which I have covered extensively. The essential problem at its core is that it tries to do too much on a small budget and panders to the fans, but not in any meaningful way that puts faith into the viewer. It attempts to combine the stories of the first 2 games and a bit of the third, and in turn, waters everything down and makes the story more complicated and much, much worse. The Resident Evil Netflix series from 2022 is stuck between the older movies and attempting to be a faithful adaptation of the games. This show is a dual narrative set in modern day as well as set in the near future. It supposedly takes place after the events of the games, but it never feels like that actually matters. This show is at worst a poorly written story with some uninteresting characters and truly cringeworthy dialogue. And at best, it's a very nice looking show with some of the best visual effects we've ever had in a Resident Evil adaptation thus far. It's just a shame they wasted their money on what essentially boils down to a weird fanfic set in the Resident Evil universe.
Some motherfuckers are always trying to ice skate uphill.
I watched this entire show just for that paragraph. And no, it was not worth it. So when you boil it down, what you get is the original Resident Evil movies by Paul W.S. Anderson. They take a generic zombie story and slap the Resident Evil name onto it. And you have Resident Evil Welcome to Raccoon City, which tries to do far too much on a budget that's far too small. Then you have the Netflix series, which tries to do both. The root of all of these problems comes down to who owns the rights to make Resident Evil adaptations, with those people being Constantine Films. They are the reason we haven't had a good Resident Evil adaptation. It really feels like they've been making these movies to keep the rights. especially with Welcome to Raccoon City having a cup of spare change working as their budget. Almost all these movies feel like they have no passion behind them. The very first movie from 2001 actually felt like they wanted to make a movie because they liked the games. I mean, that doesn't really change the fact that they still did a bad job, but all of these feel like products more than anything else. I know YouTube encourages constant pessimism and rage baiting. I don't want to just sit here and be angry. I want to be more proactive than that. I want to suggest some changes and ways to fix this problem. This won't be a highly detailed explanation, but more of a pitched roadmap for potential Resident Evil projects. To anyone that works in Hollywood or has their hands on the Resident Evil IP, Constantine, listen up. I know I've been mean to you, but just hear me out. Let's tackle this problem that has been a part of every one of these movies. I mean, the solution to this problem is give the rights to somebody else, but we're kind of stuck with them. So, how do you adapt Resident Evil? The Resident Evil series feels like such a simplistic idea to adapt into a movie or a show. It's not very complicated and it has very easy to understand characters, but it has always been wrong thus far. Well, with the problems of the adaptations usually being unfaithful, it seems like that would be a good place to start, no? In my opinion, I think there are two different paths, or scenarios we'll call them, that you can take to bring the Resident Evil games to life. The first of the two scenarios is the obvious one. Adapt the video games. But Ghouliff, Welcome to Raccoon City is based on the games, and you say that one is bad. Well, yes, my sweet summer child. It can be based on the games and still be bad. They took the completely wrong approach. Like I said, trying to combine the first two games and a bit of 3 is a very bad idea, especially since they didn't have the budget to achieve this goal in the first place. The idea of adapting the games as faithfully as possible is a very simple idea, but it gets a bit more complicated as the games go on. I think the first 4 games in the franchise being RE0, RE1, RE2, and RE3 Nemesis can all be told chronologically without much issue at all. On one hand, I think that these first 4 games could be told in just 2 movies. Combining RE0 and RE1, and then making a sequel to that covers RE2 and RE3 could work. It might be a bit tricky, but it could work. For this movie that I'll just call Resident Evil Chapter 1, maybe the first quarter or even just the opening of the film could be portions of RE0, and the rest of it just adapt the original Resident Evil Spencer Mansion storyline. Because the story of Zero isn't really that good. It's serviceable, but it's nothing special. And it's also just not really relevant to the other games in the series. I really think the majority of screen time should go to the story of Alpha Team, since that uses a much more iconic location and the story is far more important. A group of STARS members explore a massive mansion that was designed to kill them and put the Umbrella bioweapons to the test. It has intense horror, a little bit of action, and a mystery and a twist at the heart of it. I would love for this movie and every one of these theoretical Resident Evil projects to have a heavy emphasis on practical effects. Obviously, CG has its place in the film industry, but practical effects are so viscerally effective when done right that I think Resident Evil is the perfect franchise to use them in. One aspect of these game adaptations is how crucial it is to nailing the tone. If you adapt the game, the only real way to stay faithful to the feel of the games and characters is for it to be scary, yes, but it also needs to be a bit funny.
No way, Leon.
Way.
Resident Evil is a very goofy series, especially these early games.
That's right. This is the ultimate life form. Tyrant. Chris? Stop it.
I think a good example of the tone that these adaptations could strive for is 1999's The Mummy. It's a fun adventure that has a very charismatic lead in Brendan Fraser, but then, almost out of nowhere, we just have the most horrifying shit ever. It's a good blend of horror and fun that could strike a similar balance in these theoretical Resident Evil adaptations. It is a crying shame that every single Resident Evil adaptation thus far has completely ignored the iconic and beautiful fixed camera angles that can be found in the early games. There is something so eerie yet beautiful about these shots that can make you feel so unsettled at times. It would be a mandate by me to make sure we have a good portion of the movies look like this. Resident Evil Chapter 1 would be just like the game it's based on, sweet and simple. Following up with a sequel, Resident Evil Chapter 2, or Nemesis, I don't know, the titles aren't really that important. You'd obviously have to combine the events of RE2 and 3 into a single narrative, seeing how those two games take place during the Raccoon City incident. Have your main story following Jill Valentine surviving the streets of Raccoon City while dealing with and coming to terms with her trauma from the events of the previous film, all whilst being pursued by the ultimate killing machine, Nemesis. Then the story moving alongside it would be Leon Kennedy, a rookie cop having the weirdest first day ever, and Claire Redfield searching for her brother Chris. Both of their stories would get entangled as they attempt to escape the RPD and doomed Raccoon City. I know this sounds like a lot, and to be honest, it kind of is. All of these elements in one film might be a bit busy. Either one of these stories could make a great movie on their own, but at the end of the day, you could just make them two separate films that take place at the same time, and I don't think it would be too much of an issue. That's the major struggle here. If you turn these games into movies, you only have a certain amount of screen time to tell the story, whereas your other option would be to take the Fallout approach. Turn these games into a series. With this method, you could have much more time to tell your story, and it also gives you extra time that you could use to expand the world of Resident Evil. There are plenty of smaller stories that take place around the time of RE2 and 3 that would certainly not make it into a 2-hour feature film, but they could get a portion of an episode, or even an episode to themselves. The Last of Us was able to tell the story of its game while also taking some detours and time away from the main story to focus on side characters and show off some of its world building. I think a similar effect could be achieved to great success by exploring characters and events from the games that we didn't really get to see. What if we got to see what it was like the months leading up to the events of RE4, getting to see a regular family living in Spain, slowly having their neighbors and family being infected by the Las Plagas parasite and turned into monsters could be a great way to show us the lives of these innocent people that Sadler and the parasite have ruined. Or even an entire episode dedicated to the Keeper's Diary would be fantastic. That entire story is so engaging, and it's just a classic in Resident Evil lore. It could make for a great episode of TV. This is the benefit of turning these games into a series. There's just more time to do everything, as well as time to do extra, which makes it even more infuriating that Constantine Films decided to finance a high-budget Resident Evil Netflix series of a bunch of random bullshit when they had the golden opportunity to start from scratch and adapt these games. Looking at the outline of these first two films, or seasons of a series, it's already a lot of material to work with, and we haven't even passed the Raccoon City event. So what happens when we do? The main villain for a majority of these games, Albert Wesker, would still be around by this point, or at least resurrected and practically turned into an anime villain. Loosely following the events of Code Veronica, you could retell a version of that story. Resident Evil Chapter 3. Do I think this one needs to be a faithful adaptation? No. No, I do not. There are some very questionable story elements in that game.
Wait, don't shoot!
Who are you?
Huh? You're not a zombie.
But the core of that story is Chris and Claire Redfield being reunited, as well as the return of Albert Wesker. That being the foundation of this adaptation of Code Veronica is paramount. Everything else about it is okay. I think it'd actually be a smart idea to have Jill come along with Chris in the story, so that we could have the movie end on a cliffhanger of Jill and Wesker going missing, setting up the events that would unfold in our finale. But before we get there, let's take a brief detour. Resident Evil Chapter 4.
Resident Evil Chapter 4
follows the now Agent Leon S. Kennedy in his mission to rescue Ashley Graham, the daughter of the president, from a cult of parasite-worshipping monsters. This story is so iconic that it cannot possibly be skipped over. It has the horror, it has the action, and of course, it has the one-liners.
Monsters. Guess after this there'll be one less to worry about.
It is by no means an integral part of this overarching story that we would be covering in this set of movies or seasons of a series. The only real ties to the previous stories are the return of our favorite rookie cop, Leon Kennedy, and our two-timing spy, Ada Wong. Along with that, you also have the subtle looming threat of Albert Wesker in the background. Besides those, it's a very isolated story. I do think it is integral as a part of Resident Evil as a franchise. RE4 is what most people say is their favorite Resident Evil. Hell, some people even say it's their favorite game of all time. It's honestly peak Resident Evil, a perfect blend of camp horror and action. This would be a very faithful adaptation. It's too iconic to miss, and it's a story that I'm shocked we haven't seen get an adaptation yet. Now all that's left to do is finish our main storyline. Resident Evil Chapter 5. The final stand between our main cast of characters and the sun-glacioed menace. The conclusion of the rivalry between Chris Redfield and Albert Wesker. Since not many people are fans of RE6, including myself, the main part I'm stealing from RE6 is that a lot of major characters finally make their return to the franchise. This could be the big, epic finale of this storyline. This would be our Avengers equivalent, and yes, I know that sounds cringe, but I think it could be really, really awesome. In the Resident Evil games, the story kind of fizzles out. After RE5, the main threat is gone, essentially, which leads to a great finale of that game, but it does leave a question about the rest of the franchise. Most of the loose threads are either tied up or not interesting enough to follow, like in RE6. I say, go out with a bang with this movie. Give us the heartfelt character reunions, the cheesy one-liners, and I'll even let a bit of fan service slide. I will start cheering in the theater when Chris Redfield finally confronts his greatest nemesis. That fucking boulder. It would truly, and 100% unironically, be epic. Let's say all of this goes to plan, and you make either a popular set of movies or a series that is faithful to the story and events of the games, and it's actually good. What do you do once you run out of material? Well, that is where B scenario comes in. One of my favorite things about the current run of Resident Evil games is that they have returned to their roots. Resident Evil 7 Biohazard was a true return to form that reinvigorated the series by telling a small and nearly self-contained story that has a strong emphasis on horror. This game is legitimately terrifying, and the fact that it feels so disconnected from any of the other games somehow makes it feel scarier. You're playing as a regular guy in this horrifying scenario where you feel way out of your depth. I think that the idea of isolated stories set in the world of Resident Evil are the perfect way to lean heavily into a straight-up horror film. With this B scenario, you are given more room to explore new and original ideas in this world. Sometimes I've even looked at other films for inspiration as what could make a great Resident Evil movie. Barbarian, People Under the Stairs, Evil Dead Rise, Parasite. I know what you're thinking. Some of these movies aren't anything like Resident Evil. And yes, you'd be correct. I don't know if I've ever heard anyone compare the Oscar award-winning film Parasite to something like Resident Evil. But I just did. And for good reason. Hear me out. A theme and narrative structure that can be found throughout all of these films is that of something dark lurking right underneath your feet. Being comfortable and feeling safe in a mundane location, only to find that it stretches down hundreds of feet or more. That in that darkness is something that might want to harm you, kill you, or even control you. In Evil Dead Rise, you could just swap out the Necronomicon for some sort of umbrella-manufactured virus, and the movie would be nearly identical. It honestly makes just as much sense. There's something so specific about this fear that feels very Resident Evil, and that fear is exactly the kind of story that you'd want to tell. All of these ideas and dreams I have of what Resident Evil could be in live action are exactly that, dreams. I, and many other RE fans, can imagine our hearts away on what could be. Unfortunately, that's not the reality we live in. The current stream of RE adaptations that we seem to be getting at a rapid pace are certainly not quality, but it is a double-edged sword in a way. With so many adaptations coming out, not just of Resident Evil, but of other games as well, the likelihood of us getting a potentially good one is higher than they've ever been. Right? Right? Well, a man can dream. These are just my ideas, and I'm certainly no expert. This was just a fun little exercise that I thought could make a fun video. But hey, now it's up to you. I want you to let me know what you would do if you had the rights to Resident Evil. Let me know in the comments down below. Looking at things objectively, we're a very lucky fan base. Good adaptations or not. You know why? Because we have phenomenal games, and great games that just keep on coming. RE2 Remake was phenomenal, RE7 was incredible, RE4 Remake is a masterpiece in every sense of the word. It somehow made an even better version of a nearly perfect game. Capcom is still continuing to keep this franchise alive and thriving. Resident Evil is better than ever, and hey, maybe we should just be happy with that. I'm just gonna ignore all these subpar attempts to bring our beloved franchise to the big screen, because they are not worth our time, and I'm okay with that. But you know I'm gonna cover whatever bullshit they make next.